Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Stonehouse in the UK and the home of the Arboricultural Association. My name's John Parker, Technical Director at the Association, and I'm very pleased that you've all been able to join us for this very exciting joint webinar event. It's an online extravaganza organised with our friends at the Urban Tree Festival. Please select all panellists and attendees when making your comments in the chat, not just all panellists, otherwise not everyone will be able to see your wisdom. We look forward to seeing where you're all watching from. If you've got any questions for our speakers, then please put them in the Q&A panel and we will work through them at the end. This evening, we're delighted to be joined by two authors and tree people, Tracy Chevalier and Jonathan Drori. They'll be taking you on a journey through tree stories, exploring heart, mind, and soul. I'm now very excited to introduce our guests to the virtual stage. Tracy and John, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks. Can you hear us?
Can everyone hear us? I'm Tracy.
I'm Jonathan. Hi.
And we are actually from dialing in from Dorset. I know everybody's saying where they're from, and we're in a little area of Dorset called the Piddle Valley. Don't laugh. Yes, that's what it really is.
That's Dorset, southwest England,
Yes.
rather than Cape Dorset in Canada or anywhere else. Now, look, this is going to be a lot less painful for all of us. If you've got a glass in your hand or a mug, depending what time of day you are, in the UK time zone, it's definitely wine time. It's just going to be us talking and reading. We might hold things up to the camera occasionally for you to look at.
And the great thing is, because we're in the same room together rather than on different screens, we can interrupt each other. And also, we're husband and wife, so we tend to interrupt each other anyway. Don't we, dear?
I think we should start talking about our childhood trees, don't you?
Yes.
And
Yes.
maybe I'll go first.
Okay.
Like in our script.
What is your childhood memory of trees? Because I think we talk about childhood so much with trees. That's where a lot of people were introduced to trees and how they grew their love of trees.
Yeah. So if we're thinking of heart and soul, it's a good place to start. So I remember you mentioned, John, about the cedar of Lebanon, Cedrus libani, crashing out of your little game, and it sort of crashed out of my life when I was about 5 or 6, and I remember walking in Richmond Park with my parents to see a tree that we used to see sort of every week, really, when we walked there, which is a fantastic cedar of Lebanon. And one time we came across it, and it had been struck by lightning and had died, and it was being sawn up. And I remember up until that point, I think that I had just thought that my parents were in benign control of everything, really. And I kind of realized at that point that they weren't. And it was the first time that I saw my father cry. And, you know, that for a small child was quite a sort of moving moment. And I remember my mother at the time looking at the tree and saying, do you know, there was a whole world in that tree. And, you know, at the time, I just took her literally. And I thought, you know, she means all the insects and birds and things, or, you know, they explained that to me. But over the years, I've realized that it was a metaphor, really, for my father's, you know, had come to Britain as a refugee and had lost his family. And, you know, for her, it was a metaphor for what had happened to them. So my early memory was of this sort of, you know, a complete shift in my worldview, and the idea that there was a whole world, for me at the time, literally a whole world in that tree. And that's, I suppose, what we're going to talk about. What was your first?
Well, it's interesting because while you were talking, I just glanced down at the chat and I saw somebody, I'm sorry I missed your name, but saying that your favorite tree was an apple tree in your garden when you were growing up, and you learned to climb in that tree. And that was how you learned to climb trees. And that's exactly me, except it wasn't an apple tree. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and in our backyard, we had a beech tree. Beech trees are really great for climbing because their bark is so smooth. So it doesn't hurt you. It's not rough. And when I was about 5, I had an older brother and sister, and they there was a branch that I couldn't quite reach, and they could. And if you could reach that branch and a little one above it, you kind of swing your legs up and over this other branch, these two branches, you pull yourself up and you get up into the tree. So I was always watching them and get up into this tree, and I couldn't because I couldn't quite reach it. And my dad was a photographer for the Washington Post, and he went on a canoe trip down the Potomac River with a journalist, and he took photos and the journalist wrote, and they did this for the Potomac magazine, which is the magazine for the Washington Post. He was away for 3 weeks, and while he was away, I learned to climb the tree. I guess I was just strong enough and just tall enough, and I managed to get up into the tree. I was so proud of myself. I was up there. The first time I'd gotten up, Dad arrived home. And he parked the car at the end of the yard in the alley, and my brother and sister scrambled down, Dad, and they went running to see him, and I was stuck up in the tree because I could get up, I didn't know how to get down, so it's like, hello. So that tree I remember really well, and for climbing it. And when you climb a tree, you literally get close to it. You know, you're hugging it, you're holding on to it, you use it as a seat or as a sofa. I read books up there. I cried up there if I was upset, and it was a real structure in my life. So that's my first memory of trees.
So this audience that we have tonight, there are a lot of professional arboriculturalists in the audience, as well as lay members of the public. And if you're a professional, you'll be asked quite often, you know, by the public about trees. And one of the things that I think both of us have found is that if you give something of yourself in the way that we've just tried to do, that makes the communication much easier, and it sort of draws them out into things that they can talk about. Now, beech, I think, is particularly appropriate. This is Fagus sylvatica, particularly appropriate for a writer. Yes, it's got smooth.
So I chose well.
It's got smooth complexion, of course. When oaks and other similar trees grow, new bark forms underneath the bark on the outside, but the outer surface can't expand, so it cracks and forms ridges. And with the beech, it sloughs off little sort of particles all the time, so it stays smooth. And that smoothness has meant that, of course, people use it. Man's desire to fill the blank page, women's desire to fill the blank page. It makes it perfect for beech bark graffiti. And the Roman poet Virgil, he complained, actually completely hypocritically, because he did it himself. He complained about people carving their names and whatnot, and love letters into trees. Beech boards were used to frame vellum manuscript pages. And in most European languages, the word for book and the word for beech are very similar, very closely related. So in German, you have Buch and Bücher. And the words of the alphabet in German are Buchstaben, literally the stab marks, the cutting marks, cut into beech boards. Medieval writing desks were made from beech, and early experiments in printing used letters that were carved from beech. So beech really is the sort of, I think, the writer's tree, but it has a very particular feel, doesn't it?
Yeah, very smooth, and as I said, it's a great tree.
Yeah, but actually, a beech forest, beech wood, has a particular sort of
very different, because nothing grows under it for some reason. You probably know why. I don't. Do you know why nothing grows under a beech tree? I'm sure all you arborealists out there know, but
well, some things grow, but the beeches are particularly good at filtering out a lot of the light that's coming in. So the beech woods tend to be quite dark, and but what we're going to do now is have two short readings, and where both of us have tried to come at a particular tree. This time the birch, Betula, and we'll, my bit that I'll read now is non-fiction, and then Tracy will read a story about birch, and you can see how both of us, with our different lenses, have come at a tree with some differences, but also some similarities in our approach. So I'll begin.
And I'm going to depart.
Don't worry, it's not going to be hours. With cascades of delicate pendulous branches that sway in any breeze, the silver birch is as graceful as a ballet dancer. Its fluttering leaves are pale green diamonds, serrated and borne on slender twigs, warty from their resin glands. Its implausible paleness is an adaptation, helping trees that lack the shade of dense foliage to keep cool trunks in the day and night sunshine of a northern summer. Of a northern summer or in the glare of snow. The bark of young birches is invitingly smooth. In 1988, the Finnish people, ever enthusiasts for democracy, voted the silver birch their national tree. Their choice had little to do with its commercial use for pulp and ply, nor its excellence as firewood, but was an expression of emotion. By day, the distinctive monochrome pattern of snow-clad birch forests is dazzling and disorientating, but during long boreal nights, their moonlit, ghostly forms take on an eerie power. Birches abound in the folk tales of northern peoples, and many superstitions and rituals surround the tree. Trees often develop symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizal fungi, which intermingle with their roots and extend beyond them in a huge web of minutely thin filaments. These networks are especially good at extracting nutrients from the soil, which they pass on in an easily digestible form. In return, the fungus receives sugars from the tree. Individual tree species cooperate with particular fungi. The birch's life partner is Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, whose fruiting bodies, the parts we see above ground, are scarlet with white sprinkles, the archetypal toadstools of every fairy tale. Fly agarics contain a cocktail of mind-bending hallucinogens around which all manner of shamanistic rituals have evolved, particularly among Siberian tribes and the Sami people of northern Finland and Sweden. So far, so human. Many cultures have psychedelic traditions. However, the fly agaric's psychoactive ingredients are not completely broken down in the body, but excreted. This offers the enticing possibility of intoxication and a spot of social bonding by drinking the pre-drugged urine of others. Now, it's true that northern nights are especially long, and the forests might have been lacking in other excitement. However, one can't help wondering whether this practice was really as widespread as the few historic travelers who seem to be the common source of all the shamanistic pea-drinking stories were told and so eagerly reported. That's from Around the World in 80 Trees. I'll now hand over to Tracy for another view of the birch.
I'm not sure I could top that. Everybody rush out and have a little drink. Yes, that'll be interesting. Okay. Years ago, John was on the board of the Woodland Trust, which is a UK charity which supports replanting and protecting UK natives, woods and trees and planting, etc. And I got dragged in, and then very willingly dragged in to help create a book about trees. And what I came up with was Why Willows Weep, Contemporary Tales from the Woods. So I asked a whole bunch of different UK writers to choose a UK native and write a short fable, just a couple of pages, about a particular tree. So what I'm going to do is read Why Birches Have Silver Bark, which is the one I wrote. Birch trees did not always have silver bark. There was a time when their trunks were the gray-brown of most other trees. It was sex that changed things. It always does. Long ago, a girl grew up in a village surrounded by thick forests full of all sorts of trees: elm, ash, beech, birch, oak, rowan, hawthorn, hornbeam. She loved trees and knew the forest well. Unfortunately, the girls were very strict and would not allow her to have a boyfriend. The men in the village were not good enough for her, they felt. The girl was less picky and more hormonal. One day, she arranged to meet a man. "Come to the ash grove north of the village at midnight," she whispered to him as they drew water from the village well. He nodded, too ashamed to admit he had no idea what an ash tree looked like. Instead, he crashed about in the woods for an hour before giving up and going home. He's too interested in football to care about me, the girl thought, and set her sights on another. Meet me at the stand of beech trees east of the village, she instructed as they were buying bread at the baker's. This man also knew more about sports than trees and didn't even get beyond the willows at the edge of the village before he turned back. The girl decided to make it as easy as possible for her next potential lover. Do you know the old oak that stands on its own in the middle of the woods to the south of the village, she said, as they waited for their flour to be ground at the village mill. Meet me there. Surely everyone knows what an oak looks like. But no, the man stood under a lone elm, wondering if its wood would make a good cricket bat. The girl waited under the oak tree and wept at the thought of dying a virgin. My parents are right, she sobbed. The village men are too stupid for me. She gave up on men then, until one day, a stranger arrived. Not only was he handsome, but he also didn't care much about sports, turning down the chance to play five-a-side football or cricket on the village green. Instead, he wove the girl a daisy chain. She took this as a good sign and invited him to meet her, though she decided to test him on his tree knowledge. Only a tree-loving man would do. Meet me in the birch wood to the west of the village, she commanded. The man agreed. Unfortunately, however, he was from the city, where even fewer people know about trees. And being a man, he wouldn't admit he couldn't tell a birch from a beech. He simply trusted fate. If they were meant to be together, he would find her. Now, the birch trees had already had some of the other suitors stumble through them on their abortive rendezvous. So when the girl came to wait among them, they knew what might happen. Indeed, as it grew late and the man did not arrive, the girl began to weep. Then the moon appeared from behind a cloud, lighting up the forest. Among the birches, there was one tree with mutant genes that had made its bark silvery white. The other birches had often teased it for being different, but on this night, its difference became its strength, for when the moonlight struck it, it lit up like a beacon in the dark forest. Seeing its glow, the man made straight for it, and there found the girl. She was so relieved to have a lover at last that in her post-coital bliss, she vowed to protect the silver birch from ever being chopped down. This protected status ensured not only its long life, but its propagation as well. After a time, silver birches became the norm. They are still the best trees for a tryst.
Oh, bravo. Isn't that great? The thing that gets me about that story every time is that in my mind, every fable is set in Eastern Europe.
It's got a certain Eastern Europe look about it, except for the village green cricket.
Yeah, and the five-a-side football. Where did that come from?
I've been living in England for a long time. But there is a very important word in that book, that fable, propagation.
Propagation.
Propagation. We're going to talk about propagation.
It's almost as if that's a segue into something, isn't it? Almost. So look, both approaches that we've used there, we've tried to say something about our kind of human reactions to the tree, as well as everything else. So, one is clearly a story, and the other one, I hope, kind of works as a story, albeit a non-fiction story. And it's the human aspects and the sort of emotional side that captures most audiences. Now, consider all of this from a tree's point of view. They're rooted to the spot. They have to find food and water, food being carbon dioxide from the air and water from through the roots. They have to defend themselves against all those things that would come along and think that they are lunch. And somehow they need to continue the line. They need to have babies. And they need to have those babies in such a way that they're not going to compete with the parent tree. So rooted to the spot, trees have lots of ways of kind of coping with this. One way would be asexually, so that they can have suckers. So plants like ground elder, don't we just love that? Or aspens, or the elms are perfectly capable of distributing themselves with seeds. But actually, they go even better with suckers. And the Romans planted elms all over the country to grow their vines up, because they were partial to wine too. And of course, things that that propagate vegetatively, that is with suckers or with parts of themselves, they're all clones of each other or very, very genetically similar. And that means that, like the elms, they can be vulnerable to disease. So, because if something affects one of them, it'll affect all of them. So the other kind of way that trees propagate is sexually, either with cones, or the kind of most common thing that we see is flowers, pollen, fruit, and seeds.
Mm.
And it's rather kind of wonderful to me that flowers, which are evolved essentially to be attractive, they need to find an insect or some other organism.
Attracted to insects.
Yeah, a creature that will come along and will in exchange sometimes for nectar or something will douse themselves in pollen and take those sex cells which are in the pollen, the male sex cells, straight to the female parts of another flower. That's what it's all about, birds and bees.
Yeah, but can I just ask you why we're attracted to flowers too?
That's true. And
what's the point of that? I mean,
what's the point?
What's the point? But we're attracted by the color, we're attracted by the scent.
Yeah, so I think it's rather sort of wonderful that flowers which have evolved to be attractive to other organisms are attractive to us. And
but we don't pollinate them.
Yeah, well, sometimes we do, but the ones that we find flowers attractive, and I think that's because we associate flowers with fertility and food, because after the flower comes the seeds, comes the fruit, and then comes the seeds. And those are both things that we tend to eat, because the plants put an awful lot of effort and resources and nutrients, therefore, into into the seeds and into their future generation. So essentially, there are some seeds that float on air, like birch that we've been talking about, or kapok. But there are other seeds that are embedded in sweet, tasty fruit, and they've evolved to be swallowed, right? And the thing is that if you're a seed, you really don't want to be inside the digestive tract of an animal for too long.
No.
Because and you certainly don't want to be ground up by their teeth. So very often what you find is that the seed, the actual sort of business bit of the seed, contains either things that are poisonous or very nasty to taste. And so in coffee and chocolate, for example, the actual fruit bit outside the coffee seeds are quite nice, sort of cross between apricot and watermelon, really. And chocolate has this sort of fantastic kind of nutritious outer coating. But inside you have these chemicals like caffeine and theobromine in chocolate, which are actually very bitter, and they put off animals from grinding those seeds with their teeth, and instead they swallow them. And then, of course, what do fruits have in them? Laxatives, so that you or the animal poo out. Poo out, not just poo them out, so it's not too long in your gut getting attacked by all the acids and things, but actually pooed out with a little pile of fertilizer, which is even better.
Very clever. So
I'm going to do a short reading now about the nutmeg. This is from the, it's a tree, but it's in Around the World in 80 Plants, which has just come out. And this is a tree that I think, just has quite a lot of interesting aspects to it in terms of both the way it looks and also, how the seed contains chemicals that can affect mammals. Nutmeg flowers, although pale and inconspicuous, are fragrant and shaped like dainty urns, while the fruit are yellowish, speckled and about the size of a tennis ball. A single tree can yield thousands in a season. At the centre, in a glossy shell, sits the rough nutmeg kernel, or nut, that is well known as a spice. Its flavour is special, warm, woody, and thrillingly unique. The pleasure of its scent is enhanced by the intricate patterns of vessels containing the essential oils, gradually revealed by grating. Girdling the shiny nut is a succulent, lacy layer, an utterly sensual blood-red aril, or seed covering, which is itself surrounded by a fleshy husk. When the fruit is ripe, the husk splits, revealing the garish aril, an alluring snack for nutmeg pigeons, and their reward for dispersing the seed. The aril, which is the spice known as mace, dries to a warm beige and has a softer and more complex flavour than nutmeg. A little nutmeg is a warming delight, but a whole seed or two in one go is dangerously narcotic and widely reported to be hallucinogenic. One would need to be desperate for a high, though, since the side effects, vomiting, confusion, dizziness, and heart arrhythmia, are discouraging. It has only ever been a psychoactive drug of last resort. The African-American activist Malcolm X wrote in his autobiography about using nutmeg in jail in the 1940s. It was later banned from prison kitchens in the United States to avoid misuse, and generations of students have tried and generally failed to achieve a cheap and rewarding nutmeg high. The most common misuses of nutmeg these days are to powder it too far in advance of use or to heat it for too long. Both culinary crimes destroy its precious but fugitive flavour. Nutmeg should be grated respectfully at the end of cooking. That way, even boiled rice pudding can be a pleasure. So interestingly, nutmeg, which wars were fought between the French, the Dutch, the British over nutmeg, and that's quite well known. But perhaps less well known is that in 1667, the British gave up their right to the island of Run, which is now in Indonesia. They gave up their claim on it to the Dutch. And in return for monopoly nutmeg rights, they swapped it for a little Dutch outpost in North America called Manhattan. So Manhattan was traded for monopoly nutmeg rights.
Right, but what you're trying to say is don't try this at home, kids. Use the old nutmeg because it has pretty bad effects. But yes. And
so a lot of fruits, as I mentioned, have these sort of things that discourage animals from eating the seeds. And apples are a really good example of that. Apple seeds, they're bitter, they're unpleasant, and they're actually quite poisonous. There are people who've sort of chewed them as snacks and had pretty bad effects. There are cyanide type compounds in there to discourage things from eating them. And, that leads us neatly on, doesn't it?
Well, apple trees were a big part of a novel I wrote called At the Edge of the Orchard several years ago. And I got interested in it because of a legendary man called Johnny Appleseed. Any Americans in the audience will know him immediately. You learned about him at school. And he basically went through, his real name was John Chapman, and he went through Ohio and Indiana in the early part of the 19th century, selling and planting apple trees, selling both saplings and also handing out bags of seeds to settlers. Now, when people were settling or moving west in the States, pioneers, when they moved to Ohio, if they wanted to claim land, there was a requirement that they planted an orchard. And they had to plant 50 fruit-bearing trees within 3 years of settling. And this was like putting your marker down saying, I'm staying. And Johnny Appleseed was there in a way, as a businessman who brought trees west from, he used to pick up all these seeds from a cider mill in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania and then take them west. And he'd go around in his canoe on all these rivers and hand out saplings. And it was a way, it was like he was a human dispersal agent. He was literally moving the seeds around in a way that you wouldn't have actually thought. That's not what a tree normally does. It grows the apple, the bird eats it, the bird poos it out away from the parent tree, and that's how it propagates. But this was an actual person doing this with thousands, millions of trees. And so he became very well known, but he became well known after his death. He was kind of resurrected as a folk hero who spread apples, which are meant to be good for you. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. This was actually during Prohibition, when all the society ladies really didn't like the idea of what Johnny Appleseed was really doing, which in the 19th century, what he was planting seeds from apple trees. Now, if you plant a seed from an apple tree, only 1 in 10 chance of that tree becoming producing sweet apples. Most of the time it's going to be sour apples, and you can't eat sour apples. I mean, you can kind of cook them, but not that well. And what they were actually grown for in Ohio and Indiana and elsewhere was to make cider. The water supply was terrible, and so people tended to drink, and life was hard. So they made apple cider that was alcoholic, became alcoholic, and they drank cider, and they drank Applejack, which was a kind of brandy. That was what Johnny Appleseed was doing. He was spreading the alcohol far and wide, and his reputation got kind of renovated and changed. Yes, cheers, everybody. It got kind of changed by these women who wanted to promote him as it being something healthy. And I found this fascinating. And I thought, I don't want John Chapman or Johnny Appleseed to be the main character in the story, but I want him to be part of it, and an important small part of it. Now, what he did was he planted seeds straight into the ground, and he didn't, most of the time it produced what they called spitters. So apples you couldn't eat, you had to use to make cider. If you wanted a sweet tree, you had to graft. So that's another way of human propagation of apple trees. And grafting is when you take an apple tree produces really nice, sweet tasting apples. You love it. You cut a branch from it, and you take the branch and you take the rootstock from another tree and you stick it in there and you wind it all around. They used to put all this kind of mud and linen all around it. And if it took, after a few weeks, the sap rises up through the rootstock and goes into the tree. If it works, then you get an apple tree. And actually, every sweet producing apple tree or whatever you want. So every golden delicious apple that you have came from one tree. It's basically cloning. Every Bramley apple you've cooked with comes from a tree in Nottinghamshire. If there's anybody here from Nottinghamshire, I salute you, because you have got an amazing tree in a cottage that's still there, being looked after in a cottage garden. So there are particular trees, specific trees that all the other trees have come from. And I found this really fascinating. And I just thought I would read a short section about grafting. So at the edge of the orchard is, this is the American cover. There's lots of different covers, but at the edge of the orchard is about a pioneer family who move west from Connecticut, from the coast, into Ohio. They want more land. They want to see if they can make a living, and they end up in this place called the Black Swamp, which is really horrible. And it's the last part of Ohio to be settled. And James the family's called the Goodenoughs, and James Goodenough is really obsessed with trees, and he's brought apple trees from Connecticut, and he's grafting them to make an orchard. And I'm just going to read to you a very short section between him and his son, Robert, who's about 9, I think. "Where do those golden pippins come from?" James quizzed his son, Robert. "Connecticut." "And before that?" "England. Your grandparents brought over branches of their favorite apple tree." "Where in England?" Robert stared at his father with his unsettling eyes and shook his head. He was not the kind of boy to bluff if he didn't know. James was glad of his honesty. "Herefordshire. Now, tomorrow we'll graft. Go and check the grafting clay, make sure it hasn't dried out. If it needs a little, add a little water and stir it in." Robert nodded. "You know what you're looking for? You don't need me to check it with you?" "I'm all right, Pa." Robert trudged off towards the river, picking up a wooden bucket as he went. Most springs, James Goodenough grafted a few apple trees, turning spitters into eaters or poor spitters into better spitters. In Connecticut, he had learned from his father how to make a productive tree from an indifferent one, and though he now had performed successful grafts dozens of times, he still appreciated the surprise of this recreation. Grafting had always seemed a miracle to James, that you could take the best part of one tree, its roots, say, bind it to the best part of another tree, one producing sweet apples, and create a third tree, strong and productive. It was a little like making a baby, he supposed, except that you had control over what characteristics you chose. His wife Sadie viewed grafting with suspicion, an attitude she had picked up from John Chapman. "You ain't God," she liked to say, "chopping and changing, making monsters. It ain't right." James noticed, though, that she still ate the apples from the grafted trees. So that's two ways of human propagation is through, planting seeds and grafting. And I was really interested in how trees, although we think of individual trees as not moving, they're planted, they're in one place. Trees themselves, in general, do move around. For one thing, the seed dispersal, they move from the parent tree, but also humans have brought trees with them everywhere they go. So apple trees, it always amuses me when people say as American as apple pie, because actually apples are not American. They originally come from Kazakhstan, and they were brought along the Silk Road, along the trade route and the Romans ended up bringing them to the UK. And then British settlers brought them to America. So that was so they're immigrants just the way we are, just the way you and I are, and everybody. We all move around, and so do trees, and actually so do plants as well.
I really like the idea of there having been this rule that in order to claim a bit of land, you've got to plant some trees on it. And I kind of wish that any sort of developers who buy land, as part of the deal in owning land, you had to plant things on it, the right kind of things, obviously.
Well, there's something about that is really about looking to the future, and it's not necessarily for yourself, but for the future generations.
Yeah, I mean, the danger is that people who sort of put up buildings will be saying they're thinking of the future, but I want them to think about the future in the way that I think about the future. Many trees have been moved by humans an awful long way from their native range. So apples, as we've heard from Kazakhstan. One of the earliest stories of biopiracy was, the Royal Botanic Gardens queue, with which I was very happy to have a long connection, taking rubber from South America and working out how to propagate it and germinate it and so on, and then, having it planted elsewhere in the British colonial system in Malaysia. Of course, from the rubber tree's point of view, the latex has a purpose, which is to seal wounds, to sort of gum up the mouth parts of insects and things when they attack. But some of these latexes have been very, very important for us, and have therefore meant that we've taken them from one part of the world to another. Another one is gutta percha, Palaquium gutta percha, which changed the world completely in the 19th century. And it didn't change the world because its latex can be used to make golf balls, though I suspect for some people that probably did change their world. But it turned out to be the thing that could be used for insulating submarine cables. And why, I hear you ask, as one, is that so important? Well, it's so that nation can talk to nation, because that's how telephone calls were transmitted, through submarine cables. And after a few decades, there were 250,000 miles of cables that were all insulated with the product of the latex of these trees. Other trees that have been taken around the world is the familiar monkey puzzle, Araucaria,
which we both hate.
From Chile, which it graces in Britain. It graces suburban gardens, and frankly, we find it rather vulgar, don't we? But it has armor that is, why did that evolve? When you look at it, and you look at Chile today, and you think, well, why does it need such armor? Well, it evolved at the time when there were sort of very large and very alarming beasts around that would otherwise eat it, and that are now extinct. But human intervention can go very, very badly wrong. And the world is littered with examples of plants that, growing in the absence of the things that would normally eat them back home and keep them under control, become invasive. So I mentioned ground elder, which is the sort of bête noire of every gardener in this country, in England. But there's the prickly pear cactus. Wherever you go in the world, people think that the prickly pear is a sort of local thing in any arid region, but actually it comes from Mexico, and it was carted off around the world by people who wanted to grow cochineal beetles on it, to dye that sort of lovely scarlet colour for military uniforms and flags and things. In fact, the Star Spangled Banner was dyed with cochineal. But away from home and away from all those finicky little insects that had been bred for centuries by the Aztecs, this plant just didn't have anything that would eat it. By 1925, 100,000 square miles of Australian grazing land was taken over by prickly pear cactus, and they dumped all sorts of chemicals, arsenic and everything else, which still has a horrible effect today, all over it, and tried to kill it. And eventually they found another moth from Mexico that would, whose larvae would eat this cactus. And of course, that's now attacking cacti elsewhere.
Trees.
Back to trees. There are two urban trees I'd like to mention that are, absolutely hellish. That human intervention has sort of caused a bit of a disaster. One of them is back in 1850s, someone had the bright idea of taking a hardy yellow cedar from Oregon and a super fast growing but rather weedy kind of Monterey cypress from California and planting them next to each other in a garden in Wales. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the thing that went wrong was that it turned into this monster called Leylandii, which is the tree that British people love to hate. It's the thing that they plant as sort of like a living hedge. At the end of it's named after Christopher Leyland, who owned the estate that these two trees had sex in, and it's it's indestructible. It grows at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and in a sort of peculiarly British way, the British people have sort of used it to mark territory and to sort of get privacy. And at the end of the 1990s, there were 18,000 simultaneous court cases going on of people who were sort of, and murders as well. It was terrible, people sort of complaining about the trees. And in the end, guided through the House of Lords by you couldn't make this up, by Lady Gardener of Parks, is her name. A law came in that they could use antisocial behaviour orders to stop people growing these trees. And the thing that had been the main object of these antisocial behaviour orders up until that point had been either people playing hi-fis too loud and having loud parties, or Staffordshire Pit Bull Terriers and control of those. And now the thing is, Staffordshire Pit Bull Terriers are another very vigorous hybrid of two other things. And often when you get these two species that are sort of a bit weedy, and then you hybridize them, you get something that is sort of super exuberant. Hybrid vigor, it's called. And this is what's happened in Staffordshire Pit Bull Terriers and in Leylandii. And then the second one I just wanted to mention, I haven't got time to sort of do the reading about it, but is Ailanthus. Ailanthus is known as the tree of heaven or tree of hell if you're in the United States. Ironically, the US Department of Agriculture kind of sent seeds all around the country. It was an import from China, and they thought this would be a nice thing for people to grow. It grows very easily, and it might get some interesting timber out of it. It's got quite a nice sort of oriental look. Loads of seeds, 350,000 seeds for each one, for each tree, and it is completely indestructible. And it'll grow up through buildings and through concrete, and it's sort of resistant to just about everything, and is a terrific example of something that you really don't want to import. Ailanthus altissima grows incredibly high, and there was a novel called a tree grows in Brooklyn.
Betty Smith, yeah.
That is very it's about the sort of tough life of an immigrant, and there are two sides to this. Obviously, that this tree is a sort of beautiful thing, but it's also as she wrote. It's beautiful, but you can have too much of it. And she this is one of the things you need to sort of think about when you bring in, plant species from other places. There's one of the more delightful introductions into the UK is the redwood, though, which has not been something that's sort of got out of control. And there was a bit of a planting craze for it in the 19th century, and we visited a lovely grove in Wales
30-something years ago. Yeah. And there are 33 redwoods, and about 150 years old, which actually is quite young for redwoods. So they're not as huge and amazing looking as they are in, say, California and the Pacific Upper Northwest. But they stuck in my mind. And when I was writing At the Edge of the Orchard, I decided the book takes place in two places in Ohio, and the apple tree is the anchor there. And I wanted it to be about the movement west. And so that young boy, Robert, who I read about before, he grows up and he ends up going west, and he goes to California, and he discovers redwoods. He becomes introduced to redwoods and sequoias, and they are the other anchor of the book. And it's the idea of this kind of motion of trees moving from apples coming from Kazakhstan, making it all the way to America. And strangely enough, the Victorian craze for taking trees like monkey puzzles, which I see in the chat, we have offended some people by saying we didn't like it. Okay, we all have our own tastes.
Just wrong.
Yeah. And but redwoods and sequoias and other trees from California and the Pacific Upper Northwest became very popular in Victorian pinetums, as they're called, where you'd have collectors who collect trees from all over the world, and they planted redwoods and sequoias, and that's the redwood grove we saw was part of that. And actually the Lelandii is not far from there, came in Wales. So I'm going to read just a really short section where Robert comes upon these sequoias for the very first time. Okay. When Robert arrived at the edge of Calaveras Grove, he dismounted and stood, hand on his horse's neck, anchoring him. In his travels, he had seen many things that had given him an ache deep in his chest, like a splinter of sadness needling into his heart. Prairie that swept far out of sight, a tornado cycling across the gray-green horizon, snow-covered mountaintops that hung overhead like white triangles. Now he was seeing another. Two enormous trees stood on either side of the track, a natural entrance to the wood beyond. They were not as tall as redwoods Robert had seen on the coast, but they were much wider, as wide at their bases as a cabin. They dwarfed a person with their girth and the volume of wood they thrust towards the sky. If you stood far enough back to take in the whole of the trees, you didn't feel how enormous they were. If you came up close, though, you couldn't see their lowest branches. Robert left the horse and walked up the path, feeling as he did that he was shrinking into a speck beside the two trees. He put a hand on one to steady himself. The tawny red surface was spongy and thickly fissured, a fibrous bark that shed easily and turned into red dust Robert later found in his clothes and his hair, under his fingernails, in his saddlebags. The forest floor around the trees was thick and springy with thousands of years of rotting needles muffling his steps. And it was quiet, for there were no branches anywhere near him to rustle in the wind. Branches only started to grow from about 100 feet up, and the bulk of them were so high over his head that it strained his neck to look at them for long. Robert had no words for the odd, hollowed-out feeling that swelled inside him.
So, one of the things that in your writing you tend not to do, though you did in the Birch, is to sort of anthropomorphize.
Yeah.
So, some people in their stories, they create characters for the trees, don't they?
Well, I did think how do I make trees into characters in the novel without making them seem like humans. And the way I did it, like specifically in that scene, was to describe them as carefully and physically as I could. So I went to Calaveras Grove myself, which is this massive grove of sequoias. And one of the things I noticed right away was when people would go up to them, they would put their hand, they'd look up to see how high up they went, and they'd put their hand to steady themselves. So I had Robert do that, and then he touches it. And when you touch it, it's very springy. It's there's all this red dust that comes off, and I found it hours later, just the way Robert does, in my under my fingernails, my clothes, and I wouldn't have known that until I had gone there and done the research. So you always got to do the research, and the springiness of the ground around it, which is of these compacted needles from thousands of years, and all of those things I think are really important to build up a picture of the tree as a tree. I want to keep trees trees, not make them into people.
Except in the Birch story.
Except in the Birch story, where I did do, I did change it. I made it, but fables and fairy tales often anthropomorphize either animals or plants, and it's a way, in a way of drawing humans in, drawing us in.
I think it's also a way to, perhaps it used to be a way to kind of bring nature under control. I think fairy tales often dealt with quite difficult themes, and the deep dark forest, which would have been a very different place in the time before electricity and so on. I think this was a way of sort of helping children at first, perhaps, but everyone to kind of deal with the sort of control over nature. One of the plants that I absolutely love, I realise we're running a bit short of time, so is this, it's all right, I'm not going to read, so you just stay where you are, but the, darling, this, you can see another one of Lucille's fantastic illustrations. This is the mujar, or Knightsia floribunda for botanists there, but with the Western Australian Christmas tree. And this has a very sort of intentional kind of feel to it, because this tree will seek out, it's a hemiparasite, so it does photosynthesize, but it'll seek out the roots of other trees. It's got hydraulic secateurs. It plugs itself into other plants and draws off water and nutrients. And the way it seeks out those plants is because the roots can sense various plant hormones and things. Here's the crazy thing, that some of these plant hormones are also present in plastics. So the plastic insulation of buried telephone wires in Western Australia is a prime target for this Western Australian Christmas tree, and it comes along and it severs these telephone wires, which I think is a lovely way of nature getting its own back. That sort of pleases me, but it's only a hop and a skip, isn't it, from anthropomorphizing to superstition. And I can imagine that in this audience, where there are a lot of scientists and arboriculturalists, that there's a sort of mixed feelings about superstition. I certainly have mixed feelings, because superstition can be incredibly valuable, as in, say, Madagascar, where the superstition that one's ancestors the soul of one's ancestors is present in the baobabs, means that the baobabs have survived. And so that's a kind of good superstition. But then, of course, we've got all sorts of other kind of pseudoscience going on with climate change denial and all kinds of other things, which we're not so happy with. It's a very difficult balance, I think. Yes,
it is. It is. I think because we're running short on time, we should probably leave it there. Except I think that we, since we're not going to anthropomorphize trees, but what if we treeify ourselves? So if you were going to be, what's your favorite tree? If you're going to be a tree, what tree would you be?
I would be the Allodendron dichotoma, which is this sort of, here's this glorious picture. That's the aloe, which aloe vera, on this side, but this is the tree, the Allodendron dichotoma, which is the quiver tree. It's called that because the San people of Namibia have used the hollow branches for keeping arrows in. And the reason I love that tree and if I was a tree, that's the tree I would be, is not because it thrives in the middle of a desert and is fantastically resilient. How clever, which it is. But for two reasons. One, it's the national tree of Namibia, which means that everyone smiles at it when they see it. It's like driving a Morris Minor. And the second reason is that it's got this kind of funny waxy coating that makes you want to touch it. The waxy coating is there to protect itself from ultraviolet light, probably. But the idea of being a tree that people smile at and want to stroke, I think I'd like to be the quiver tree of Namibia. What about you, dear?
I would like to be a copper beech. Because I grew up with a beech that I climbed. I have a real fondness for beeches, but copper beech is, I only really got to know them when I moved to England 30 something years ago. And although I'm sure they have them in the States, but I associate them with the countryside here. And I like to think of my American life was a green beech, and my British life is copper beech. So that's why B. So I think on that note, shall we open it up, throw it open to questions and comments from you?
I think that's a good idea. Time flies, doesn't it?
Sure does.
Cool.
Thank you very much, both. I was going to say you could keep going for as long as you like, by the way. There's absolutely no time limit for you two at all. It's great. Brilliant. Thank you. Well, we've had lots of really good discussion in the chat and a few questions in the chat. If you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A panel because I get a little bit confused. I'm simple enough as it is and I'm losing stuff on there. Before it disappears, I'll ask you one that is in the chat from Kerry, who's asked if you're aware of the work of Suzanne Simard and what you think of that work, because there's some remarkable work been done. It looks like you're preparing something there.
Yeah. Yes, both aware and actually it's supporting the computer. That's kind of funny, isn't it? It's just the right size. But in fact, I'm doing an interview with her for shortly in June. I think it's June the 23rd for 5x15. If people are interested, and Suzanne's work is really interesting because she was one of the first scientists to show that those mycorrhizal networks that I mentioned when I was talking about the birch, they sort of carry information between trees. So as well as carbon compounds and so on, the products of photosynthesis. So these fungal networks plug themselves into the roots of different trees, and if a tree is under attack, then it's been shown that through the network, other trees that are kind of part of that fungal network can essentially be triggered to make defense chemicals and to defend themselves. And that at the beginning of the season, when the deciduous trees aren't really photosynthesizing very well, conifers can, have the products of photosynthesis, the sort of these carbon compounds and sugars and so on, effectively transmitted through these networks to the deciduous trees. And at the other end of the summer, it works the other way. So it isn't quite all dog eat dog as people used to sort of think in forests. One of the interesting things about her work is that one of the questions I'm asked most frequently, actually, after any talk about trees, and I suspect that a lot of the audience here are the same, is people want to know about sentience. They want to know if trees are intelligent. And I think we have to be really careful about extrapolating this kind of information transfer into intelligence. Because information is transmitted between computers, for example, that aren't necessarily intelligent. They've been sort of evolved or programmed to do that. And ascribing intentionality to trees, I think, is quite a sort of a difficult thing to do. Now, Suzanne doesn't do that in her book, but I think one of the things to be aware of is that a lot of the audience really, really, really want to believe that trees are intelligent, and define intelligence, right? But if you know that people have a particular sort of misconception perhaps about science and about what we know and don't know about trees, then one has to be a bit careful about what misconceptions you inadvertently reinforce. So fantastic work there, and it's the great book, Suzanne Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree.
And somebody in the chat said that they think it's being made into a film, and yes,
it is, yeah.
Which is great to have a book about a film about trees.
Well, the film will really be about her life, because she grew up as a logger, a logging family, and sort of poacher turned gamekeeper turned poacher, or the other way around, or whatever it is. Yeah. Next question.
To say it's interesting as well. I think huge respect to Suzanne, because she sort of started saying a lot of these things when everyone was like, "That's crazy talk. That can't be true." And then now it's kind of not quite mainstream, maybe, but it's certainly getting there. And she was out there right in front.
Yeah, and she used proper sort of scientific techniques, radioactive markers for molecules to see exactly what molecules had gone where in a forest, so you could see exactly the root of everything. She did proper work. Yeah.
And somebody in the chat just said one of the characters in Richard Powers' The Overstory is based on her life, which is, yes, great book.
Yeah, very, very good book. Highly recommended. I suppose on that theme, another question in from Catherine asking whether or not you could expand on the relationship of trees and fungus and the mycelium network that helps trees communicate with each other. I would say that there's whole webinars we've done about fungal networks and mycelium that you're more than welcome to watch. Drop us an email. But I don't know, Tracy, Jonathan, if you've got any thoughts on, it's on the same themes we've just discussed, really, but the importance perhaps of mycelium.
I think it's it is the same theme, and I would just point you at the work of the Arboricultural Association. Actually, is really good in this regard. It's I think one of the interesting ways of looking at this is, at first we look at everything from our point of view, don't we? We look at it through a human lens, and we think that trees must be acting like us. We anthropomorphize, and then the next stage from that is to say, no. The trees are, helping. Have evolved for the good of the community of trees or the forest as a whole. They've evolved to, be able to transmit information effectively, not necessarily intentionally, but the information is transferred in a forest for the good of the forest as a whole, and that's the tree's eye view. But how about this? Think of it from the fungus eye view, right? So if you think of it from the fungus's point of view, the fungus benefits from having a forest that is photosynthesizing more rather than less. It benefits from having healthy trees, that are photosynthesizing at lots of different times of the year, so that the fungus itself can get the products of photosynthesis, and in return there's a payment. It sort of takes phosphates and minerals and so on out of the soil in a way that the tree roots can't do. But it's quite interesting to start looking at it from the fungus's point of view. They've managed to manipulate the trees.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of people who would say that the fungi are farming the trees, really, and it's all about the fungi, and the trees are just incidental. If everybody wants a talk that'll really blow their minds, then at some point later this year, Professor Lynn Boddy will hopefully be doing a talk about fungal memory and looking at whether or not fungi have memory. So
fantastic. Watch that, everyone. That would be great.
It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. Okay, I think maybe even continuing that theme a bit further in a way, because I think it's all related. A question from Alan. In the current climate of depleting ecology, how would you both use and sell the idea of trees and their benefits to persuade people to want to reconnect with the natural world and so endeavour to want to do more to protect their local ecosystems? The reason I said it's connected is because I think when people start understanding the work of Suzanne Simard, for example, it gives them a different perspective. But what other ways can you see trees being used to sell the natural world and that reconnecting people to nature?
It's I think what we've been emphasizing tonight is the telling stories and the stories that trees that we can tell about them. But I think another way of going at it is in a way, what we started this talk out is what are our favorite trees is from our childhood. It often starts there. And I think, I suppose it's an obvious answer. I'm sorry, I'm not being more creative, but it starts with your kids and it starts in school. If it's not starting with your family, then it's starting with tree planting and tree playing. Actually, I think we don't let our kids play enough. You have to. When I was a kid, everybody climbed trees, and now it's a sort of anomaly to climb trees. And I think that it's important to let kids loose and let them go up them. And if they fall and break an arm, they do, but it doesn't happen very often. So mostly it should be real crucial interaction, I think. And I think actually a lot of that happened during the pandemic. We were in London and during the first lockdown. And we live near Hampstead Heath, and we went for a walk every day, as did everybody else. We were all desperate to get out. And I just noticed so many more kids climbing trees and really being there. And I think that makes a huge difference to your life.
I think the key is, the danger is that professional arboriculturalists and scientists see the world through a scientific lens. And the way that we persuade each other of things is by, in the way that you persuade people to have a vaccine, say, is by saying, look how effective it is, and look how little risk there is. These are very measurable things. But a large part of the world doesn't operate that way. They operate on a much more emotional level. And I think that if you look at advertising, really good advertising, even if it's for products that you hate, and look at the techniques they use, I think that the tree world and the nature world could learn a lot from that. So one of the things that I kind of consistently sort of moan about is the fact that a lot of the oil industry, the fossil fuel industry, they speak with a very coherent voice. It's not a voice that I particularly like to hear at the moment, the messages that they're putting out, which I feel are a lot of greenwash, but they do speak with a very coherent, clear voice, whereas the environmental movement is very split between different organizations that all have their own different sort of angles, which are all important, but one of the things that we know in communication is to just sort of keep saying the same thing over and over again, very, very loud, and simplify, which of course scientists find very difficult to do, because you always want to make it accurate and have the caveats and so on. And the other bit is the emotional connection. So what we're both trying to do in our different ways is to create an emotional connection between people and the environment, which will mean that people want to then care, and if people care, then they will protect.
Absolutely. Good answers both. Thank you. Tracy, just picking up on your point, perhaps, there's a question came in from Andrew about what do you feel would be the most effective way to broaden the interest in trees amongst the younger generations? Well, you're completely right when you said it starts with childhood and children climbing trees, learning about trees, and then carrying that love through their life. But how do we go about actually engaging the younger generation?
Well, I think one way of doing it is getting a kid to plant a tree, and plant it when they're relatively young so that they follow its progress as it grows and they grow. So they go back and visit it every year, or they plant it in, if they have a green space near them that they can plant it in, something that they can see every day. And that feeling of lengthening, kids have a tendency to be very in the moment, and it's hard for them to understand that a tree that they plant now is going to be how big it's going to be in 50 years time, but they can see how much it grows in a year's time. And I think that having looking after it and feeling responsible for it gives them more of a connection.
Yeah,
and I think the Woodland Trust does a lot of that, a lot of tree planting with school children. And I think what's really important about that is not just the planting the tree, but going back with the same class 2 years later to see how they've done, and maybe the kid remembers, they take a picture so they can remember which tree they planted and did it survive or not, because a lot of times they don't, but sometimes they do. And it's, I think that kind of nurturing makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm. I'm very glad you said that, Tracy. We always say a lot of this at the Arbor Association. All of these tree planting targets are wonderful. Of course, we all want trees to go in the ground, but there's no point planting trees if you're not going to maintain them, make sure they're established, look after them for the long term. And I think getting children not just to plant trees, but then to go back and check how they're doing is a really important message.
I mean, the government has talked about this new tree planting scheme, the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, and that's great. But I think it's also really important. It's actually quite hard to plant a tree. You know, we've been given trees before, and we don't have that much space. And to get the right place is really important. And I think it's also important to, you know, just plant trees anywhere. You plant them where, you know, one of the things the Woodland Trust is trying to do is to connect up different green bits to make green highways for the natural world, for the animals to be able to move along. And so when you can connect that up, rather than just having a clump here, clump there, it really makes a difference, like an exponential difference, rather than just the trees themselves. It's other things get affected as well. So I think it needs to be done with thought and care and responsibly.
Absolutely. And Gillo's just said in the chat, accessibility to trees is so important. And that's always been true, but hopefully it's been brought home to more people over this last year, the pandemic. You know, there's some people have more access to trees and green space than others, and that's something that needs to be addressed as well. We've got quite a few questions in. If you all right to go on for a little bit longer? We just
we're okay if you are. Yeah.
Well, I'm more than happy, and we've got more than what we got. 142 people still watching, so I think everybody's happy, and lots of people sharing their recommendations for tree books in the chat as well, which is
yes. I'm just writing them down.
You can request a copy of the chat later, so you can still concentrate on Tracy and John's answers. Okay, let's have if you want a sort of existential question, it's always good to turn to Mr. Anthony Mills, and he hasn't disappointed this evening. Anthony says, for a world that is increasingly secular, do you think the extended life of trees and their larger than human life stature provides an avenue for the expression of spirituality and an extension of life beyond our own into a greater ecosystem?
Anthony, I love you.
Anthony,
come and have a drink with us, Anthony.
I think Anthony is leading the witness. Would you agree that? What do you think?
My Lord.
This is what Anthony does every week.
Anthony, well done.
Well, bless you, Anthony. I don't think we've met, but I want to meet you now. I think that you know, what if I can paraphrase what I think you're saying is that human beings need to understand that we're not the only thing around, and that there might be something sort of bigger than us and more important than us. And I couldn't agree more.
Anthony, my answer to you is that I tend to write historical novels, and people ask me why history is important. And the way I look at it is you can actually apply to trees too as well. We especially when we're kids and when we're growing up, we tend to live in the moment, and we think about the moment we're living in, and maybe a bit about the future, what we're going to do. And I feel like as you get a little bit older, you start to appreciate, you go from being the one-dimensional in the moment to thinking ahead. So that gives you a little second dimension there. But if you really want to be a full-rounded person, you look back too, because it gives you perspective, and it gives you it makes you not the dot or the line, but actually, well, it could be an extended line, but you could line out that way instead of straight. And you it makes you into a more rounded person, where you actually have a better grasp of how small we are as individuals, which is actually can be a relief. Rather than thinking you're the center of the universe, you're not. And it's great to step off the center stage and to acknowledge our ancestors and where we've come from. It makes you feel incredibly there. And trees do that by, you know, as I said before, you plant a tree and you don't, you know, so many people plant trees too close to their properties, their houses, because they just don't think about what it's going to be like in 50 years and how it's too close. So all these trees are having to be taken down because of that. You know, you have to think ahead and to be forced to think back, like the tree has lived so much longer than you, way before you, and it's going to live way beyond you. And I just think that's I wouldn't go so far as to say it's religious or spiritual, as you're kind of implying, Anthony, but I would definitely say it makes us better people.
I would go as far as to say it's spiritual, but One of the things which is, I suspect, not the way you intended this bit of conversation to go. There's an interesting tree of Cameroon and Gabon in West Africa called the Iboga. And one of the ways that the tree is used is that the roots contain a sort of mind-altering substance that, in the context of the Bwiti culture, makes people feel that they are connected to their ancestors and to their heirs. And it's partly because of the mind-altering substance and partly because of the context in which it's taken. But that same plant is actually being turned into a sort of a chemical that can be used to wean people off heroin addiction in the West. But I suspect that's probably not what what you're intending with your question.
I think another interesting side of that is something that you talked about earlier on, John, about the sort of the quantification of benefits of trees and how that's very useful to be able to quantify the benefits, but that you can't essentially quantify everything. I think when you're talking about superstition and stuff as well, and that idea of a sort of a spiritual experience, it's very hard to put a monetary value on how you feel when you stand in front of a 2,000-year-old yew tree. You can't put a value on that.
There is a sort of super danger that many others have commented on in different fields, that you measure the things that are easy to measure, and then those are the things that become important because they're easy to measure and people have them in spreadsheets and all of that. And you can see successive governments of different colours doing this all the time, all over the world. You can see how we've done that with our education system. Where I remember our son Jacob, when he finished his GCSEs, said, "What the hell was that about? And now I can get back to learning again." Yeah. We do things which are easy to test rather than and easy to put a number on, rather than necessarily being important.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm going in a slightly different direction from that, but it's easy to measure how many trees you've planted. Less easy to measure how many trees you've saved. And I think we tend to forget that, if you're talking about carbon sequestration, it's a large mature tree takes in much more per year than a little sapling. And it's really important but it's not as measurable. It's not as sexy as planting and obvious as planting a new tree. That just sounds like, oh, we're doing something really great. But actually what is really great is if you save that big old oak tree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You can't count the trees that haven't been cut down, I guess. So Anthony's asked that question. Well done, Anthony. But if anyone's going to out existential Anthony, it is my very good friend Neville Fay, who has come in with a question that I'm going to ask. And it's my gift to you, Tracy and John. Thank you, Neville. Neville says, could we have had conceptual thought without our relationship to the tree? Which came first? If you like Anthony, you'll love Neville.
Well, there is a way of taking your question, Neville, which is absolutely literally. And therefore, I will, because that gets us sort of off the hook. Humankind, could we have survived without the products of trees and got to, got to the stage of evolution that we're at? Debate, but there are, we've in order to grow as a civilization, we've had to domesticate a whole lot of things, including a bunch of grasses. What have the trees given us? A whole load of medicines, a whole load of fruits and nuts and vegetables and things that we eat, clothing. I know this is not what you intended, but I'm thinking that without the tree species, we might have just about got off the ground. Been a lot harder.
But we don't know, because the trees were here before we were, and so we came into the world with them there already, and so we've adapted to that. So it's impossible. Neville, you're just naughty. That's just a crazy.
He is naughty. Knowing Neville, I suspect he's also thinking about. And sorry to put words in your mouth there, but I'm thinking that if to early humans, trees would have been the longest living things that they would have seen. And I suppose maybe the time span in which a tree is alive and unchanging may have then given some benchmark to human development or lifespans.
Yeah, maybe, though. You know, I mean, it does amaze me that you know, the kind of measurements that you know, apparently illiterate people managed to do on astronomy, which would have taken generations and generations in order to make astronomical observatories. This is sort of pretty stunning when you kind of think about it.
It's interesting, though, the whole idea of the tree's lifespan is basically longer than ours, and it's affecting, maybe, Neville, what you're saying, and what you're saying, John, is that it's affecting how we perceive time. And that's a big deal. And maybe if there weren't plants or trees that lived longer than us, we would have a different sense of time. Is that what?
Well, that's what I was saying about astronomy. Yeah. That, you know, we would have been still seeing things over many, you know, changing and coming back to the same point over many generations. So yeah, tricky one.
Yeah.
See how quickly we get philosophical here. Sorry, we didn't prepare you for this. It's good. They're good, aren't they? They're lovely, this lot. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. There's one that I'm partly going to answer, but then I will happily, obviously, share it with you because you're who people want to hear. Umi's asked about most housing developments in London have no trees or nature design into their build. Who is responsible in councils ensuring that trees and nature are part and parcel of any new housing developments? The reason I said I'd answer is purely because I think everybody needs to give huge kudos to the tree officer, who is the person employed by local authorities to look after public trees and to sort of oversee tree preservation orders and the like. And tree officers are fantastic people. They're hugely under-resourced. They need more support and more attention and more respect. They're the custodians of our urban trees, and they're generally brilliant. So I would say that it's those people who are largely responsible, but they don't always have the resources to do what they know they need to do and what they want to do. So that's my answer. Tracy and John, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on Umi's question.
A couple of things I would add is, you know, one, I would, you know, just harking back to Johnny Appleseed, you know, I would try and ensure that tree planting and tree custodianship is part of any new development. But also I would make sure that there is some part of the budget that is held back until the trees are established. And, you know, you see too many architects' drawings of beautiful sort of trees all planted around new developments, and somehow they never seem to quite happen that way. And so, you know, there should be an artist's impression, and then that's compared 5 years later, and then you release the rest of the money.
I think the other thing is that it's you can say, well, the government should be doing this, the government should be doing that, but actually another way into it is to train architects and designers to automatically think that planting trees is as important and essential to their plan as the buildings or the plumbing, the sewage, whatever. That trees should just be automatically a part of that. And maybe that comes down to training in architectural schools.
The difficulty with that is that, you know, architects and planners are employed by someone. And, you know, I think you know, it needs to follow the money, actually. So, of course, they need to be, you know, sort of educated in that way. But I think many of them are. You know, the architects and planners that I speak to seem to have that knowledge. But you know, if everything's down to a price and people get permission to go ahead on the basis of designs which are cheaper, then, you know, unfortunately that wins out. Whereas if there were really strong financial incentives, both incentives and disincentives to sort of operate in the wrong way, you know, that would, you know, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Okay, look, we've got a couple of minutes left and we've got two more questions I reckon we'll squeeze in. One of them's a really nice one that I think I'll sort of aim at Tracy first, because I think this was typed when you were talking about propagation and apples and Johnny Appleseed and cuttings and the like. Thomas has asked a question that I really like. Would you say stories are a good way to propagate trees?
Yeah, they're a good way to propagate the ideas of trees. They don't literally propagate trees, but sure. I mean, if you could imagine somehow impregnating books with seeds, and that you have to plant them that way, that would be. But no, I think definitely trees. I think that's what this whole evening, in some ways, is about. Is we're both storytellers. We're just coming at it from fiction and nonfiction, but that line is really blurred. I mean, I do a lot of research. John does tons of research, and I do a lot of research for my book. So I tried to be as accurate as I could, although the people are made up. Certainly the botany in at the edge of the orchard is not made up. And so in that way, I think definitely stories can really teach us a lot about trees.
Yeah. I mean, you said it. I mean, that's why we're here. Human beings are sort of pattern recognizing organisms, and you could see that really what we're doing is transmitting patterns from one generation to the next in our DNA. But we ourselves recognize patterns even when there are none. So give people a pattern. In other words, a story. Stories have a pattern to them, or a series of patterns to them. People recognize those and then start caring. And so, yes, I would say that stories are a terrific way of propagating trees. And my sort of piece of advice, and it comes from a lot of, trial and error, a lot of error, and a lot of sort of quite humiliating research when I discovered what people were thinking of my television programs when I used to make them, and what worked and what didn't, is that, as scientists, you're often trained not to make things personal. You're usually told to write in passive language and to, be dispassionate in every way. But actually what changes minds is the heart and the soul.
Lovely answers. Thank you very much. Well, let's follow on from that into our last question. Again, a seamless link. And the last question is one that we often ask, we always ask our webinar presenters. It's our 45th webinar now, I think, 46th. And we've had lots of great answers, but it seems even more appropriate than normal to ask it to our guests this evening. What is your favorite tree-related book? Tracy, you go first.
Funny enough, I happen to have a prepared answer. My favorite tree book is The Man Who Planted Trees by Jean Giono. It was written, Giono was a novelist. We worked in a bank, and then he wrote novels. And he wrote this, it's basically a fable about a man. This man comes across this shepherd who is every day goes out and plants 100 trees, 100 oak trees, acorns, and in an area of southern France that's really barren, and nobody thinks they're going to grow. And then the narrator comes back 10 years later after World War I, and he sees this kind of gray haze on the hills, and it's the oak trees. The guy plants 10,000 trees, and they're not all of them have survived, but a lot of them have, and they're growing, and they're 10 years old. And now he's moved on to beech and birch, and he plants, and he completely changes the ecology of the area because water comes back and people come back. And it's really, I mean, it's not a true story. Everybody thought it was true. They really wanted to believe, but it was just a reminder of how trees can transform a landscape and a culture.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah.
I would pick, from non-fiction, I would pick The Forest Unseen by David George Haskell. And I think that what he did so brilliantly was just take a meter square or a yard square of old growth forest in the United States, and just meticulously observe it, sort of in the tradition of Darwin. And just extrapolate from his observations in all sorts of interesting directions. And so I would say that is my favorite non-fiction book. And then for fiction, I would actually pick Arto Pasalinen's book, Year of the Hare, which is about someone living in a forest for a year, hare, H-A-R-E. which is a sort of absolutely charming and enchanting book from Finland. And I never realized that the Finnish have quite such a sense of finely tuned irony. It's a sort of absolutely wonderful, wonderful read.
Great choice. I should say that The Year of the Hare, Hair, is probably nowhere near as interesting. Nobody go. Don't waste your time reading that one. There's some great answers. Thank you. I should say, John, as well, just to put you on the spot, I think this is the first time we've had the author of a book that was selected as another presenter's favorite tree book, because a few weeks ago, one of our presenters said Around the World in 80 Trees as their favorite book. So there you go. So fantastic.
Who was that?
I wouldn't possibly name and shame who it was. You'll have to watch all the webinars and find out who it was.
Oh, bless her or him. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, look, thank you, Tracy, John. That was absolutely brilliant. It was a really special webinar. Wonderful to be a part of. Thank you both so much. We really, really enjoyed it. Sophie's actually just sent you a link to a little catch up afterwards. So have a look at that if you so desire. And thank you to everyone watching. You're all wonderful. Great questions, great discussions. We really appreciate you coming. I'd just like to stress again, we do our webinars every week. This is a special joint event between the Arboricultural Association and the Urban Tree Festival. Please check out all of the other stuff the Urban Tree Festival is doing. They're doing some great stuff. It's all online on their website, so please go and check it out.